1.55 million acres on the Olympic Peninsula and include parts of Clallam, Jefferson, Grays Harbor, and Mason counties. This area is made up of a complex combination of ecosystems commonly found in the Pacific Northwest. The three major ecosystem types are coastal, forest, and montane. The Olympic Torrent Salamander is generally found in both lowland and montane forests, as well as temperate rainforests. And though they share many ecological characteristics, the forest management practices of the Olympic National Forest and National Park are quite different. The Olympic National Forest continues to utilize even-aged timber harvesting practices such as clear cuts. Even-aged timber harvest is the practice of cutting all or nearly all of the trees in a specified area and then allowing them to grow for a designated number of years before harvesting again. On the Olympic Peninsula, loggers must wait 30 years between harvesting. However, the Olympic National Park rarely allows timber harvest at all, and it is only used to control insects or disease or to preserve natural or historic resources. As opposed to focusing on a single portion of the peninsula or a single federal jurisdiction, and I started, hold on just one moment.
You're good, Travis.
Yeah. Sorry, just had a little Wi-Fi snafu there. As opposed to focusing on a single portion of the peninsula or a single federal jurisdiction, my study area consisted of the entirety of the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park. My field assistant and I started in the northeast corner of the peninsula near Discovery Bay and worked counterclockwise over the course of the summer to survey a total of 139 sites at 77 streams, averaging not quite 2 survey sites per stream. The zoomed in map shows my study sites, as well as the borders for the HUC8 or 8-digit hydrologic unit code subbasins that encompass the National Forest and National Park. A subbasin is just a mid-sized watershed management unit used by a variety of organizations to separate out different watersheds and larger catchments. I separated my study area at the HUC8 level because, according to the National Resources Conservation Service, this is the most common level for watershed management. I was interested in looking at the variability in the patterns I found across the peninsula on a scale that could be applicable to management decisions. The 2008 Forest Service Conservation Assessment of Rhyacotriton olympicus that I mentioned earlier identified timber harvest as one of the top 2 threats facing the species. Some of the studies establishing the association of the Olympic Torrent Salamander with older forests are Raphael et al. And Adams and Burry, both published in 2002. A 1996 study by Welsh and Lind found a similar relationship with another Rhyacotriton species in forests in Northwest California. There are some other articles that I looked at that specifically focus on timber harvest, but not on amphibians, and those arrived at some mixed conclusions. So Arismendi et al. Published a 2017 study on the Olympic Peninsula, which found that timber harvest may indeed increase stream sediment. However, Jackson et al. Published a 2001 paper which stated that riparian buffers, which are strips of trees and understory vegetation alongside streams that help protect from the effects of activities like timber harvest, prevent significant changes in stream sediment. And as described in a 2019 study by Martins, buffers have been used in national forest management practices since 1988. The conservation assessment identified culverts as the other major anthropogenic threat to the torrent salamander. There were 3 types of culverts we encountered in the field: box, arch, and pipe. The top 2 photos are box and arch culverts respectively, while the bottom 2 photos are different examples of pipe culverts. The primary effects of culverts on streams are acting as a physical barrier, preventing the upstream movement of organisms, potentially increasing sediment deposition downstream of culverts, and they also often change the stream morphology immediately downstream of the culverts, creating deep pools at the outflow, which can also amplify the other 2 effects. As you might be able to guess from looking at the pictures, the impacts of culverts on streams are affected by the type of culvert employed. Also, for those wondering, far and away the most common type of culvert we saw in the field were pipe culverts. When I started my project, the overall question that guided my exploration of the literature was, how do anthropogenic forest stresses impact the Olympic Torrent Salamander in streams throughout its range? Anthropogenic being something that originates with human activity. As I delved into the literature, this question was divided up into specific questions and hypotheses relating to both occupancy and abundance. I formulated two specific questions for salamander occupancy. Question 1, how does local forest age impact the occupancy of Rhyacotriton olympicus in streams across its range? And question 2, are the culvert effects on torrent salamander occupancy driven primarily by sedimentation or by the culverts acting as barriers to salamander dispersal? Because occupancy simply measures whether or not a species is present at a given site, the occupancy questions and subsequent hypotheses were formed through the lens of measuring the minimum suitable habitat requirements for this species. My first hypothesis is focused on local forest age, and based on what I learned about the associations between torrent salamanders and mature forests, I hypothesized that sites surrounded by mature forests have higher average occupancy than sites surrounded by recently harvested forests. The figure below the hypothesis shows a generic prediction of what I would find using a logistic regression curve, which is a common type of analysis for assessing data that have a binary outcome. The figures in each of the following hypothesis slides are generic representations of my predictions for each of my hypotheses. My second hypothesis is focused on the effects of culverts. And based on what I learned about how culverts act as one-way barriers to salamander movement in streams, I hypothesized that Rhyacotriton olympicus would have higher average occupancy in stream reaches downstream of culverts than in upstream reaches. Although the first two questions are nearly identical to my occupancy questions, I approached the abundance analysis through the lens of measuring factors that create the optimal habitat for an organism as opposed to creating the minimum suitable habitat. So I felt like exploring the same questions might yield different results. The third question was created out of the fact that streams are often experiencing the effects of culverts and timber harvest simultaneously, and that this would cause an interaction based on how these two stressors affect streams. Again, based on the numerous studies that have found associations between torrent salamanders and mature forests, I hypothesized that as the distance from a stream to the nearest harvested forest increased, average salamander abundance would also increase. Because the effects of culverts can be divided into culverts acting as a physical barrier, which would prevent upstream movement of salamanders and likely lead to greater average abundance in downstream reaches, which is hypothesis A, and culverts cause increased downstream sediment deposition, which would decrease the access to preferred microhabitat amongst the rocks on the stream bed, which is hypothesis B. I developed two alternative hypotheses for the effects of culverts on Olympic torrent salamander abundance. And finally, because streams are often subject to the effects of both timber harvest and culverts, and because both timber harvest and culverts can act on streams by increasing the amount of sediment in the stream, I hypothesized that these two effects would interact to decrease Rhyacotriton olympicus abundance more than could be solely attributed to either of the main effects of timber or culverts. Once I had developed an understanding of my study system and the questions I wanted to investigate, I needed to determine how to go about gathering the data I would need in order to answer the questions I had posed. The very first step in my fieldwork, before I ever set foot in a stream, was determining where I would be surveying. First, in the spring prior to my field season, I used ArcGIS Pro to locate all of the places where Forest and Park Service roads cross headwater streams based on forest road and stream data. Next, I applied for the necessary research permits with both the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park. Let me tell you, this was a very different process for each organization. I then prepared around 3 stream sites for each day in the field, with a couple contingency sites in case one of the sites didn't meet the necessary criteria upon arrival. This could mean that the stream was crossed by a bridge, or a stream bed was dry because we were surveying in the summer, or maybe the stream was just unreachable due to unsafe terrain. This happened fairly frequently, and over the course of the season, I really dialed in how many contingency sites I would need. Also, due to travel constraints, we were only able to survey 2 sites on the last field day of each week in order to make it back to the ferry on time. Once we arrived at a suitable study site and had donned our trusty waders, we recorded the time and the GPS coordinates for each culvert stream crossing. Then we used a digital rangefinder to measure 50 meters upstream from the edge of the road and walked upstream along the bank to the 50-meter mark. Here we put a painted stake in the ground to mark the bottom of the 10-meter stream reach that would serve as the survey site, and again used the rangefinder, this time to determine where the upstream end of the 10-meter reach was. After we completed the upstream data collection, which I'll describe next, we repeated the whole process downstream. After we arrived at and marked off the stream site using the painted stakes shown in the image to the right, we followed the same procedure at each site. 1, measure physical and chemical stream characteristics, which for me were pH, turbidity, dissolved oxygen percentage, stream flow, and dominant and subdominant stream substrate, judged by a visual estimate throughout the stream reach. 2 was measure the near stream forest, which included canopy closure percentage, aspect, or the compass direction that the stream was facing, stream gradient, or the slope of the stream, and dominant tree type, also judged by a visual estimate of the trees surrounding the stream. Lastly, we sampled for salamanders, searching all of the habitats suitable for torrent salamanders, following an entirely separate procedure. We searched from downstream up, turning over all pebbles, cobbles, and boulders that we could. We sifted finer substrates carefully through our fingers and down to about the hard bottom of the stream bed, or 6 inches, whichever came first. And if a salamander was seen escaping deeper, we pursued it. We captured both adult and larval salamanders, separately recorded the counts of larvae and adults based on appearance and location of capture, and then immediately returned them to the spot they were found. Once all of the data were collected and entered into an Excel spreadsheet and cleaned up and organized a little bit, I used the following analysis process. The first step, which I completed prior to data collection, was the development of the questions and hypotheses. Next was translating those into 2 sets of meaningful statistical models, one for occupancy and one for abundance. This consisted of returning to the literature, as well as spending time seriously considering which variables were likely to be the causes of the patterns I hypothesized I would see. Then I conducted preliminary goodness of fit tests to determine if the global models for each of those sets fit a theoretical distribution. For that, for the occupancy analysis, I used a binomial distribution, meaning that I assumed that the outcome would either be one thing or the other. Salamanders are present or they're not. And for the abundance analysis, I used a Poisson distribution, which is just a statistical distribution of points that's commonly used for count data. If the global model passed the goodness of fit test, I was able to conduct the model selection analyses. For this step, I chose to measure the outcomes using AIC scores and some AIC variations. So AIC stands for IKK Information Criterion, and it's a statistical metric of relative empirical support for models within a data set. It's a pretty versatile measure that has adjustments that can be applied for a small sample size, which is called the AICC score, and over dispersion of data, which is defined as greater variability than would be expected based on a given model. I then selected the subset of models with a delta AICC score less than or equal to 4 because models under this threshold show strong to moderate empirical support for being the best model in the candidate set. And then I've been continuing to use this model subset for further analyses that I'll talk about in just a little bit. Now that I've explained the why and the how of my study, we can move on to an arguably more interesting portion, the results. So overall, we found salamanders in 42 of the 77 streams we surveyed and 61 of the 139 individual stream reaches. Of the 61 stream reaches with salamanders, 25 were downstream of culverts, while 36 were upstream. We also counted a total of 517 salamanders, 64 adults, and 453 larvae. We differentiated the life stages based on morphological characteristics as well as where the salamanders were discovered, because the adults can be found either in or out of streams, but the larvae are strictly found in the water. This came out to an average of 3.72 salamanders per 10-meter stream reach. As this histogram shows, the count data were heavily skewed towards low counts, including a large number of zeros, which is that biggest bar all the way to the left of the graph, which is more or less the pattern we expected to see in the curve. And as you can see, you've got this kind of general swooping motion from really high numbers to really low numbers. That's basically what we were hoping for. And then all the way at the other end, you might see that little tiny green bar. There was one stream reach that contained 50 salamanders. I also looked at some of the basic spatial variation in my results to get a preliminary look at patterns across the peninsula. However, it is important to note at this point that looking at patterns at such a coarse resolution when I measured at the stream reach level takes away some of the nuanced variation that occurs over such a huge area. The map on the left currently shows the average detection probability and will momentarily show the average abundance in each of the HUC8 subbasins ranked by color. The figure's color ramp moves from blue to yellow in order of increasing detection probability and average abundance. As the map fades from one frame to the next, we can see that in the north and west parts of the peninsula, the patterns of lower occupancy and abundance mirror each other. It's just in the east and south, specifically the Hood Canal, Skokomish, and lower Chehalis subbasins, where there are differences in ranking of which subbasin has the highest average values. Here's the complete list of models used in the occupancy analysis. So I have a null model and a model based on just the stream number. I also have 10 models based on specific variables that I measured, as well as a number of models composed of various combinations of these variables. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about statistical methods, an important step of the model selection process is the creation and analysis of the candidate models. So each of these models was assigned an AICC score as a result of the analysis, which quantifies how well the model explains the variation in the selected response variable, in this case, salamander presence, with a penalty for adding more explanatory variables. The models that are bolded are the ones whose delta AICC scores, which is the difference between a given model score and the best model score, were below 4. I'm not going to show you guys the full results table because it's basically just a lot of numbers, most of which mean very little. However, I think we should take a closer look at the subset of models that were listed in bold on the previous slide. The R-squared values tell us how well the models fit the data, and these numbers suggest that the models are a pretty good fit, though it does seem that anytime turbidity is in a model, it causes a slight decrease in the R-squared. The AICC score itself is not particularly important because the score is unique to the models and data used in a given analysis. All the way on the right, IKK weight is a metric of the probability that a given model is the best model in the candidate set. There are two important takeaways from this table. One is that all 7 of these models include stream gradient, listed as GR. The other is that the cumulative weight of these models is 0.9994 out of a possible 1.0, meaning that the models not included account for only a tiny percentage of the cumulative weight or probability that they're the best model in the set. If we take a moment and look at the logistic regression plots for each of the variables included in the model subset, we can see that gradient is the only one that has a significant effect on salamander occupancy based on that really low p-value. It also has this nice sloping curve that as stream gradient increases, so does average occupancy. The other three variables have large error bars, which is that dark gray shaded area surrounding the curves. And as indicated by the p-values above 0.05, there are no significant effects among those other variables. In order to make a better prediction about the detection probability for Olympic torrent salamanders in stream reaches around the peninsula, what I'm doing now and what I will probably spend the next couple weeks doing is multiplying those detection probabilities by the IKK weight for each model in the subset from the previous slide, and then summing those numbers to get a new detection probability that's been weighted by the various models in that subset from a few slides ago. As I finish up the thesis and transition to preparing a manuscript for publication, model average detection probability has some really exciting applications. So the overall goal of model averaging is to be able to predict the Olympic torrent salamander occupancy that you might find in a given 10-meter stream reach using a spatial occupancy probability distribution, which really just means that over the course of the entire peninsula, we might have fairly accurate predictions about the likelihood of finding an Olympic torrent salamander in any given 10-meter stretch of the stream. If you can imagine every 10-meter segment of the streams on the map above color-coded based on inputting the calculations for each of the models used in this analysis and weighting those numbers based on the model weights, you could imagine that there might be some hotspots and potential areas of concern that could be addressed through management policy. A map like this could be used for any number of management policies for Olympic torrent salamanders. Switching gears now, we're going to take a closer look at my abundance analysis. Unfortunately, my abundance global model failed the goodness of fit test, which prevented me from completing the model selection analyses as planned. Once the original plan failed, I used the remaining predictor variables to conduct post hoc generalized linear regressions on predictor variables that weren't used in the candidate set. And what I mean by post hoc tests is that I'd already tried to complete the analysis, and so I returned to kind of the data exploration component, which is generally completed prior to conducting the analysis. The first group of predictor variables I analyzed were the presence data for other species we encountered while surveying for torrent salamanders. I conducted regression analyses for 4 of the cohabitating species. The top left plot is for tailed frogs. The bottom left is for Cope's giant salamanders. The top right is for cohabitating fish species, which were mostly small salmonids, but also some rockfish. And then in the bottom right, it's crayfish. The presence of both tailed frogs and fish had significant relationships with salamander count. Streams containing tailed frogs had significantly higher salamander counts than those without the frogs. However, streams where fish were present had much lower salamander counts than those without. I then moved on to stream temperature and other predictor variables directly related to temperature, because several sources stated that Olympic torrent salamanders are sensitive to increased stream temperature. However, I found that none of the predictors in this set had a significant causal relationship with average salamander abundance. The last group of post hoc regressions I conducted were on pH, stream flow, and elevation, because these were some of the last predictor variables that I hadn't explored yet. While the results for pH were not significant, both stream flow and elevation had significant relationships with salamander count, though in opposite directions. The data showed that as stream flow increased, average salamander count decreased, but when elevation increased, salamander count increased right along with it. Just as an anecdote, I wanted to point out one of the sites that was a notable outlier. This was the downstream reach of the second stream we visited on July 22nd. As you can see in the picture, the vegetation on the stream bank is different from the trees and bushes in some of the other pictures. This site was primarily inhabited by sedges, which are a group of grasses often associated with wetlands. The stream also had a very low gradient and was slightly below the stated minimum value in the species elevation range. However, we found 28 salamanders, which was our second highest total for any individual reach. Just based on the site that I described, if you had told me that that was where I would be surveying, prior to sampling there, I would not have thought that we would have seen any salamanders at all. But clearly there was something about this site that made it suitable for an extremely dense salamander population compared to what I saw in a lot of other streams. And given that one anecdotal outlier does not undo patterns seen in large data sets, it's likely inconsequential that this site deviated from expectations, but it does highlight a general lack of knowledge about the full range of streams that Olympic torrent salamanders can inhabit. So, what do all these numbers and patterns mean for the Olympic torrent salamander? We'll quickly revisit my initial hypotheses and then move into some interpretation. I originally hypothesized that average occupancy would be higher in streams surrounded by mature forests because of the suite of environmental parameters provided by mature forests. However, while forest stage was included in the subset of models with strong empirical support, individual analysis of forest stage showed that overall it had a poor model fit and the direction of the relationship was the opposite of what I predicted, with recently harvested forests having higher average occupancy than mature forests. I find this interesting because it definitely does not match the trend throughout the literature of an association between torrent salamanders and mature forests. I also originally hypothesized that average occupancy would be higher downstream because of the physical barrier presented by culverts. However, stream direction was not included in any of the subset of models with strong empirical support, and as shown above, again, I found a pattern that was the exact opposite of what I thought it would be. I actually found that upstream reaches had higher average occupancy than downstream, and this is just so interesting to me that both of these two patterns were the exact opposite of what I thought they would be, because there's plenty of support in the 2008 conservation assessment as well as other studies that suggest that culverts do act as physical barriers to upstream salamander movement. So this is something that, it doesn't match up. Unfortunately, due to the overdispersion of the abundance data, I was not able to draw any strong conclusions, or really any conclusions at all, about my abundance hypotheses, which was a bit of a disappointment because it prevented me from making some direct comparisons about which variables impact occupancy and abundance at the stream reach level. From these results, the clearest conclusion that I can draw from my data about the cause of the variation in average detection probability across the peninsula is that stream gradient was the most important predictor of salamander presence at the 10-meter stream reach level. The increased occupancy seen at steeper gradients is likely due to the increased flushing capacity of steeper streams, meaning that they can more easily maintain those clear, cold headwater streams and that space between the substrate on the bottom of the stream that are preferred by Olympic torrent salamanders. Additionally, our results do not support some of the existing assumptions about the relationship between Olympic torrent salamanders and mature forests. I can't say that they disprove this association by any means, but I did not see the strong support that I'd expected. I also found Olympic torrent salamanders in 18% of the streams at 10% stream gradient or lower, which is not a pattern supported by the literature. As a matter of fact, there's one study that stated that it's unlikely that Olympic torrent salamanders will be found in streams below 11% gradient. This could be a result of the implementation of riparian buffers in Olympic National Forest timber harvesting, which helps to preserve the health of headwater streams susceptible to increased sediment load, but it could just be that torrent salamanders are not quite as fragile as assumed by some of the studies. And overall, I can conclude that neither of the anthropogenic forest stresses I initially explored had as notable of an impact on salamander occupancy as high as I had expected. Unfortunately, I can't really draw any strong conclusions about what drives torrent salamander abundance at the stream reach level. There was some evidence that, maybe the presence of another species is important. In the literature, there's plenty of information stating that torrent salamanders are generally only found in non-fish-bearing streams. And this may be due to competition, but it also might just be due to other factors about the stream that, favor either fish or salamanders. Based on these conclusions, I arrived at the following major implication for the management of Olympic torrent salamander populations. There is a clear need for targeted stream management focused on protecting the headwater stream reaches most likely to contain Rhyacotriton olympicus in order to maintain or even increase levels of local occupancy. This could take the form of protecting potential migration corridors, prioritizing culvert removals, or even prioritizing areas for increased protection or restoration. Hopefully, as I continue with this model averaged detection probability, I'll be able to shed some more light on that. Moving forward from my thesis, there are several avenues for further explanation or exploration of this system. The obvious direction is the one that I'm still pursuing and was just talking about. I'm really hoping that by completing this model averaging analysis, I'll be able to make some stronger predictions about Olympic torrent salamander stream occupancy and, just where on the peninsula the efforts for conservation need to be focused. Also for occupancy, because all of my measurements were taken at the 10-meter stream reach scale, I would like to see a study of habitat correlates at a more macro scale. A 1996 study of the southern torrent salamander managed to compare several spatial scales simultaneously, but I was warned early on that the authors of that study had a prodigious work ethic, so I chose a slightly less ambitious approach for my first study, but I'm interested to see if there are patterns that would be revealed when looking through a wider lens. I would also like to see a study of Olympic torrent salamander dispersal strategies. If culverts were not impediments to the stream, then I'd like to find out why, because Olympic torrent salamanders, according to the literature, have rarely been found further than 2 meters away from stream banks. For abundance, the avenue of further study that I find most interesting would be to look at interspecific interactions and how those impact abundance. The literature contains very little about how the Olympic torrent salamander interacts with other species, as I mentioned earlier. Additionally, I would also like to see an abundance study done at a different spatial scale for the same reasons that I was talking about for occupancy. Here are the subset of sources that I used to help formulate this presentation. And before we wrap up, I just want to acknowledge and thank a few people and groups. First, my incredibly dedicated and optimistic field assistant, Reed Henderson. Next, the members of my committee who have been patient and supportive of me for the past 2+ years. I'd like to thank Western for allowing me to undertake this endeavor and for providing the funding for my work. And the Olympic National Forest and Olympic National Park for providing me the necessary permits to collect my data and for providing me an opportunity to get out and conduct science in one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Are there any questions? And now I will unmute you all. And I think, yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you guys all so much for being here.
Okay, plenty of time for questions.
If you have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask it. And if you don't have questions, I either did a great job or a terrible job.
No, we'll just wait here for the first question. That's how we do this. It'll come. Yes, please.
Oh, go ahead and unmute. There
we go.
So Travis, this sounds really frustrating to me that all of your hypotheses were wrong. Was it frustrating? Like, did you look at this data and just kind of hang your head, or was it more of a fascinating discovery?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer probably depends on, the day of the week or maybe even what time of day it is, right? Because there were definitely times that I felt really frustrated and like I'd spent so much time reading the literature, and I went out and collected the data, and then it didn't show any of the patterns that I thought it did. But ultimately, I think it's more just fascinating in that there are different patterns, and maybe patterns that haven't been, fully explored for this species that, is rare, and according to a number of different organizations is vulnerable to, decreased population. So I think it's pretty fascinating and an exciting opportunity for further exploration, which for scientists is a good thing because it means studying stuff. Thanks for that question. I think Evan has a question over here.
Yeah, I had a question. You mentioned using the results of this study to sort of generalize to being able to look at salamander populations throughout the Olympic Peninsula. So do you think that since you collected within, I think, 50 meters of culverts, that the results will be similar if you look, 500 or 5,000 meters from where there's sort of these effects of humans?
That's a really great question. And the answer is, I'm not certain, though I would guess that as you increase the distance from the culvert, especially, it would probably be more pronounced downstream, right? Because, streams flow in one direction, so you're more likely to see kind of this one direction effect of the sediment transport and how that might affect the salamanders. But some studies that had done a little bit of, capture, mark, and recapture of salamanders rarely found them further than 2 meters away from the original capture site. So it doesn't seem like these salamanders tend to disperse very far from whatever their little home range is. So so 50 meters is a huge distance relative to 2 meters. So I'm not sure how much more of a decrease we would see by increasing that distance from the culverts.
Okay, and my other question is, how do you, this is a simple question, I guess, about fieldwork. How do you know that the salamanders you find is representative of the amount of salamanders that are actually there? Is there a way to sort of capture your sort of collection efficiency?
That's a great question. And the answer is that, yes, there is sort of like an overall way to, capture collection efficiency. The first part was really just making sure that I followed field procedures that had been established by other studies looking at these same species that had been, found to be effective. So, for example, the searching all of the suitable habitat and the flipping over and sifting through all the substrate, working from downstream up. All of these were things that were that we expected to use in order to make sure that our procedures were consistent. But one of the papers I looked at regarding salamander and amphibian field monitoring procedures found that with Olympic torrent salamanders, using those procedures over a 10-meter stretch, they found a 3.8% chance that they would not find salamanders in a stream reach in which the salamanders were present. Unfortunately, I didn't take meter by meter collection data, so I wasn't able to calculate that for my own data set. But just basing it off of those previous studies, we were confident that we were going to find what was there, and we wouldn't find stuff that wasn't there.
Okay, awesome.
Any other questions for Travis?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that one anomalous stream that had like 50 salamanders in it? Like, any idea what was going on there?
Yeah, I'd love to speculate a little bit more about what was happening there. So this was a pretty interesting reach. So the upstream side, 50 meters away from the road, was in a fairly typical forest stream environment. But the downstream reach, because we were at pretty low elevations, you're getting down towards some larger, larger streams and rivers that this particular headwater stream fed into. So, not too terribly far beyond the 50-meter point, which is where we started surveying. It fed into a larger stream, and there's a fair amount of evidence in the literature that torrent salamanders don't spend much, if any, time in larger streams. So that larger stream may have just been acting as sort of a barrier to further dispersal by the salamanders. This actually was likely the case for our major outlier, not too far downstream of that reach as well. The stream bed, went down into the water table, so there may have been this effect of kind of bunching salamanders together when they could have been dispersed further. But I guess the more interesting thing to me was, some of these associations with like the riparian vegetation and the low gradient, which were also sort of outliers. So yeah, I think it was just a super interesting site that may have been caused by a barrier effect, or it could have just been the result of, a wider range of habitat association. Thanks for that question, Tina.
Any other questions for Travis?
I think I got 3 more. We'll start with Uncle Rick up at the top there, and then we'll go to Katie, and then my mom, Jennifer.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So one thing I was thinking about is predation. Is predation a factor at all in terms of the salamander's role in the overall ecosystem? Are they a prey species, and can that be a factor in dispersal?
Right. So the literature doesn't have a ton of information about which species predate torrent salamanders, including species within the stream, right? So I could see it being a very real possibility that large crayfish would be able to capture and eat the salamanders. These small fish that we see in the streams would likely be able to capture salamander eggs or maybe small larvae. And Cope's giant salamanders could eat even adult salamanders, because the giant salamanders, as the name suggests, get pretty big, up to about 14 inches long. And then outside of the stream, I could see, small carnivores like raccoons or maybe some mustelids, eating the torrent salamanders, because they're really opportunistic predators. But there's just not a lot in the literature that establishes any sort of relationship, in that way. But yeah, that's a really good question.
Thanks.
Katie.
Hey, Travis, good job on your presentation. My question was, I know you're looking for the specific species of salamander. Did you find an abundance of any other in this area, or was it not their specific habitat with the clear, cold upstream? So I guess as a sum, did you find any other salamanders?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a fun question, because yes, I found a lot of other salamanders. As a matter of fact, the Cope's giant salamander, we didn't count them, but I think I found more of those than the torrent salamanders. They seem to have a wider range of, suitable habitats. The tailed frogs were also extremely abundant. If you've ever seen their larvae on the underside of rocks, they kind of look like these little black leeches. So we flip over these rocks and find these little squiggly leech-looking tadpoles, which was fun. And then we also did find a couple of other terrestrial salamander species right along the stream bank, most notably the western redback salamander and Van Dyke's salamander, but we didn't find either of those in particularly large numbers, no. Thank you. And Mom, Jennifer.
Thanks. Good job, Trav. So I'm wondering what your plans are for sharing your data with Olympic National Forest and Park.
Yeah, well, they already have the raw data, because that was something that they asked for, just, the spreadsheets. But I'm not expecting that they'll have spent, anywhere near the amount of time combing through it that I have. So part of the agreement with them was to send over any reports or literature that come out of this project. So once we kind of finalize this thesis and everyone's happy with it, I'll be sending PDFs of that to both of those groups as well. It's a little daunting because one of my contacts at the National Forest was like one of the people who did the conservation assessment back in 2008. So like just to be sending stuff to them that says like, I didn't really find some of the patterns that you said were there, is going to be, a fun thing, but whatever. I found what I found. Dr. Binney. Oh, Dr. Binney, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I was needing to be unmuted. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the question of like who preys on these salamanders. How toxic? Salamanders have a certain amount of toxicity. How toxic are these to, well, humans, but other organisms that might prey on them?
I have no idea. That's something that, as far as I can tell, has not been studied at all with this particular species. It's certainly nowhere near the level of something like the rough-skinned newt, which is a notably toxic salamander species native to this area. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's been explored by people looking into those relationships.
Okay, and then kind of tied to that, for thinking back with habitat, could you remind me what they prey on or what they feed on?
Yeah, they are just going to be preying on some benthic invertebrates, mostly, just very small insects and larvae found either on the stream bed or on the, near stream banks.
Okay, so what they feed on will drive probably where they're going to be found unless they have different habitat for mating and breeding.
Sure.
Did you look at any of their prey, any other different organisms and where they're found relative to where you would expect to see them in their habitats?
I did not. That's another great, avenue for further study. And, I haven't, again, there's relatively scant literature for this species. So I have not seen any studies, none that I was specifically looking at anyways, that, kind of tie prey location and availability to, salamander occupancy or abundance.
So it sounds like there's some more studies to be done on this species. That's pretty exciting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Yeah, any more questions? For some reason, Zoom is being very unfriendly to me in terms of muting and unmuting others and myself. I don't know why. Any more questions? Great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's just wonderful to see such a large audience for Travis's talk. And I think, I don't know, John and Roger. Oh yeah, let's have that first so we can clap. You can virtually clap. You can.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Great. So thanks again for being here. I assume the way our committee moves forward is just ask everyone to leave and then we keep going instead of going to some secret private Zoom session or something. I don't know.
Sure, we can just assign a breakout room and we can do that as well.
Yeah. Okay.
But if everyone's leaving, thank you all for attending and supporting me